Hi, everyone. Welcome to Neuroelectrics webinar. My name is Rafał Nowak, and I will be your host today. So today we'll be talking about brain stimulation methods to improve memory. And I'm very happy to welcome our guest speaker. We are honored to have today Professor Vince Clarke. Good to have you.
Thank you.
So please let me quickly introduce our speaker. Professor Vince Clarke is a professor of psychology and neuroscience and director of the Psychology Clinical Neuroscience Center at the University of New Mexico in US. And his research involves the study of both healthy cognition and clinical disorders, employing a combination of imaging tools, including MRI, EEG, fNIRS, and a wide variety of brain stimulation methods. And his group is looking for new ways to combine brain imaging and different forms of energy like electrical, magnetic, infrared light, physical pressure, and even ultrasound together to increase learning and performance in healthy people and to treat symptoms of dementia, addiction, schizophrenia, chronic pain, and other disorders. So welcome, Vince, all yours.
Great. Thank you, Rafał. Thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate it. All right. Welcome, everybody. I'm excited to be here. I'll be talking too quickly about 3 sets of studies, all focused on improving memory. And so I'll just get going. Let's see. I'm a scientific advisor for Neurogenesis Incorporated. I'll be talking a bit about some products that they're developing. So I want to start out talking about memory. And in some ways it's obvious, in others it's not, but why focus on enhancing memory? And in fact, long-term declarative memory is associated with almost every aspect of our conscious life in any case. So we need to understand the past or remember the past to understand what's going on in the present. If we lost our past, we wouldn't know anything about what's happening currently, and we wouldn't really be able to predict the future. A lot of predicting the future has to do with remembering what's happened in the past. Remembering, making a plan, and then remembering how to follow that plan, solving problems, reflection and imagining things, language and literacy, your sense of self, all of that is tied into your long-term declarative and associative and other related forms of memory. So improving memory could lead to improvements in many aspects of our life. Now, when memory falls apart, that we call that dementia. And the most common form of dementia results from Alzheimer's disease. And neurofibrillary tangles and amyloid beta plaques start to form, killing neurons, ultimately destroying our ability to encode new information and eventually recalling older memories and so on. There are other forms of neurodegenerative disorders that cause dementia as well, but Alzheimer's is the most common. In 2019, it's estimated that over 50 million people live with some form of dementia, and again, most of those Alzheimer's. And the total cost of that is estimated at over $1 trillion US. So it's expensive and kills over 1 million people a year. It's a big problem. So non-invasive brain stimulation offers a potential to at least treat some of the symptoms of dementia and to enhance memory in healthy people. How do we use brain stimulation to do that? The method that I've tried to develop and adopt and try and get other people interested in is based on neuroimaging. So the very simple idea is to characterize brain processes associated with whatever you're trying to enhance, in this case, memory, and then differentiate a low-performing versus high-performing state, and then choose a non-invasive brain stimulation protocol that produces a functional state similar to that higher-performing state. So the idea is that what we see with neuroimaging might actually have a causal aspect to it. And if we can get people's brains acting like a high functioning brain, they might actually behaviorally start to act more high functioning. In this case, have a better memory. And once you develop this, if you're lucky, you'll be able to extend it to other similar tasks, that there's some kind of far transfer of the effects you're having on the brain, and that you're able to do it in a number of different populations. And if all this works, if it repeats and so on, you probably found something that's real. So my first attempt with this was a learning study where people learned to identify threats that were hidden in pictures like this one. And this was a Department of Defense in the US funded study, so it had a military component to it. And if you look closely in this image, initially you don't really see a threat, but if you look closely, you'll notice that there's an outline of a sniper here on the shadow of the roofline behind you. So that's a potential threat. So we gave people images like this, asked them to identify the threats, gave them feedback whether they were successful or not. And with imaging, we saw a number of brain areas that changed as people learned to identify those threats. And one of the largest changes was here in right inferior frontal cortex. And this box here is an outline of a TDCS electrode placed over that location. So we targeted the region that showed the largest change with learning that we could access with TDCS. And then in a second group of subjects, we applied TDCS while they learned the task. And we found that people doubled the amount of threats that they could learn with the same amount of training. We replicated a number of different ways. One of them was to give our stimuli and methods to a group at another university, at George Mason University, with Raja Parasurman and Brian Falcone. And they found pretty much the same results. Again, a large improvement in learning, and also a reduction in false alarms, and a big increase in D prime, measure of signal detection. And over a number of replications, we continue to find that there's an increase in the amount of learning with this TDCS protocol relative to sham. Now, one of the things I worried about was whether this might just be good for identifying threats. So with Ben Gibson, who recently got his PhD in my laboratory, Ben developed another task called the pretext task. And in this task, they were shown a series of images like these, and you had to learn to categorize these images into one of two categories. And it could be done based on the visual characteristics on what you see in these images. But as with the other task, it's relatively difficult, and it took people a while to learn how to do it. What we found is that with sham TDCS, people learned about 4% or improved their score by about 4% with training. With TDCS, they improved their score by 20%. And also with cathodal current, so instead of anodal current over F10 versus the contralateral arm, we use cathodal current, and there was still an improvement, although smaller. And the effect sizes were really large. So for anodal current, we saw about 1.7, Cohen-C of 1.7, with 391% improvement in learning. So a really shockingly large effect. And we've done a number of follow-up studies looking at these effects, trying to understand why it works, how it works, what condition it works under, when it doesn't work, and so on. Our most recent study was the memory study, Modern Energetic Methods of Response Improvement, to make a cool acronym. But we did a randomized double-blind clinical trial using the same TDCS protocol in older adults, 50 to 90 years old. You can look it up on clinicaltrials.gov if you're interested in some of the details that are there. But again, this is 2 milliamps of current for 30 minutes with the anode over location F10 and the cathode on the left arm. And the sham is 0.1 milliamps of current with the active condition 2.0 milliamps, but otherwise the conditions are identical. And we had a healthy group showing no evidence of dementia, and then a group with mild cognitive impairment, which is the first step in the progression of dementia. And the primary outcome was their ability to learn the pretext task. So we hypothesized that we would get an improvement in learning, and this shows the protocol in more detail. So in most of the subjects, we were able to do imaging. So we did imaging first, collected pretext test baseline, took them out of the scanner, did training with either active TDCS or sham TDCS, and then back in the scanner for testing, along with some other MRI-based imaging that we did. And we had a total of 87 subjects, 58 were healthy, and 29 with mild cognitive impairment. Average age 64 for the healthies and about 74 for MCI group. And 39 of this group of 87 were sham and 43 active TDCS. So across all 87 participants, that's combining the healthy and MCI groups, we saw, again, an increase in learning, in this case, about 2.5 times. And just looking at the MCI group, the difference was even larger. Without TDCS, they're basically almost unable to learn the task. And with TDCS, we saw an improvement, and the ratio of learning between the sham and verum conditions was about 10 times. So with TDCS, they did 10 times better than with sham. In the healthy group, there was also an effect, although smaller, but still there. And comparing the healthy group receiving sham and the MCI group receiving verum, the verum group MCI did almost a little over 100% better on the task. This wasn't significant, but in general, they did at least as well as the healthy group. So we can say that this TDCS protocol is making the group with mild cognitive impairment act like the healthy group, act and able to learn as much as the healthy group. And this shows over time, starting at baseline, both groups were at about 50%, which you'd expect by chance, and then 4 training blocks, and both groups improve block by block, and then there were 4 test blocks at the end. And the difference between the active and sham for the healthy older adults began almost immediately after training started. But for the MCI group, what's interesting is there's a delay. So it wasn't until the 4th training block that you start to see a difference between the groups, as if there's some delay in the effects of TDCS taking hold, affecting plasticity, affecting attention. Whatever's going on here seems to have a longer delay, but it's still there. We also looked at electric field magnitude under the F10 electrode. We modeled that and compared that to performance. And in the group receiving active TDCS, we saw that the higher the electric field magnitude that was being modeled, the better their performance on the task after training. So it seems like there's a fairly clear relationship between the amount of electric field entering the brain and their ability to learn the task, which is another piece of evidence that TDCS actually is influencing brain function and producing a demonstrable effect. So to summarize all this, the effect sizes were pretty good. And the original pretext study in young adults average about 23 years old. Cohen's D was 1.7. Across all the subjects in the memory study, it was 0.59. For just the MCI group, it was 0.52. Now, what's interesting is by comparison, if you look at effect sizes of medications that are currently being given for Alzheimer's, like anti-cholinesterase drugs, cholinesterase inhibitor drugs, the average effect size is about 0.29. For memantine, given at later stages of Alzheimer's, the effect size is 0.4. So the effect sizes we're getting here, at least in the short term, are actually larger than the effect sizes for medications currently being given. So in conclusion, this particular TDCS protocol produces large improvements in learning on at least 2 different tasks. And we're also finding that there's a large improvement in older adults, both healthy, and the largest effects we've seen so far are in older adults with mild cognitive impairment. There's a number of other factors that we're finding are associated. I don't have time to go into detail, but the effects are associated with electric field strength being modeled. Also, the ratio of white matter to whole brain is positively associated with learning effects with TDCS, and the ratio of CSF to the rest of the brain is negatively associated. So as the brain degenerates and shrinks and CSF grows, it seems like TDCS is less able to produce an effect, which is unfortunate, but there's still a long period of time before CSF becomes large enough in relative volume to diminish the effects of TDCS. We also looked at default mode networks and found some relationships there. Again, I don't have time to get into them. And honestly, we just finished this study about 6 weeks ago, so we're still putting the details together. But all of this together suggests that there's direct effects of this TDCS protocol on the brain that enhances learning. And based on our prior studies, it's likely involves increased attention, increased metabolism, and excitatory neurotransmission, all of which help promote or lead to increased plasticity in the brain. Although we have yet to find a direct measure of plasticity per se, but in terms of increased metabolism and so on, we have a number of pieces of evidence suggesting that that is at least involved in the mechanism of effect of this TDCS protocol. And while yet to be directly compared, the effect sizes that we got in this study at 0.59 are higher than commonly used medications for dementia. So that's the end of the daytime stimulation. Now we get to night. In my lab, we've had another series of studies having to do with brain stimulation during sleep. And in this case, what we did in all of these studies is to record EEG and use that to identify the proper timing of stimulation in the brain to enhance memory consolidation processes that occur during the deepest stages of sleep. So most of you probably know while you're awake, you have a lot of high frequency activity. As you get drowsy, it becomes lower and lower frequency. And as you go to sleep, and then in the deepest stages of sleep, there's something called slow waves that average about 1 hertz and seem to coordinate your brain's ability to store information into long-term memory. So what I'll talk about are algorithms that we've developed and applied to identify slow waves and slow wave sleep and stimulate using, first of all, electric current and then auditory tones, but that are timed with EEG and that are able to give you a way to enhance the brain's ability to perform consolidation processes. So slow wave oscillations correlate with consolidation. That's been known for quite a while. These slow oscillations And at the peaks of the slow oscillations, there are thalamocortical spindles. And along with the spindles are spindle ripple coupling. And slow waves are around 1 hertz, spindles 12 to 16 hertz, and these ripples up around 50 hertz or higher. So there's this interesting relationship between very slow and very fast processes during sleep, all involved in this memory consolidation process. So the first set of studies I'll talk about were done in collaboration with a group at Hughes Research Labs in California. And they came up with algorithms that recorded EEG, identified slow wave oscillations, and then used those slow wave oscillations to pattern the frequency and timing of alternating current stimulation, which then fed back into the brain for a period of time. And most of the details of this are described in a paper in Journal of Neuroscience with Nicholas Katz as first author. So if you want details, you should look this up. In order to do this work, we actually built a number of sleep labs in my research center. We'd never done it before. I can tell you it's a lot harder than your typical research study. Having to have people comfortably sleep in your laboratory is not easy, but very worthwhile. Also, neuroelectrics, and thanks again for inviting me to speak today. So neuroelectrics developed a prototype system for us that records up to 64 channels of EEG and stimulates up to 32 channels. And so we use this to record the slow wave oscillations. It extracted the phase and frequency of those and then stimulated that participant's natural phase and frequency occurring at that moment in time, and then recorded and stimulated again. So this shows that process graphically. So from a number of channels shown here in light green, it averaged and developed what they call a virtual channel, which is the average across all of these individual channels. And in that, look for evidence of slow waves, like shown here. And then the algorithm would plan out into the future based on the information that it just received, and stimulation would start. And the idea would be that the stimulation that would go on for about 5 seconds would match the phase and frequency as best as possible. And one interesting thing is that these slow waves really aren't sine waves. It's a more complicated phenomenon. And in any case, but this system produced sine waves to try and mimic those as best as possible. Let's see. And this shows data from 16 subjects, and each one shows the average slow wave before the onset of stimulation and after. And in these radio plots here, the red shows the average timing of the onset of stimulation relative to what was actually zero phase in the slow waves, if that makes sense. So it basically validates the method, showing that it's getting pretty good relative to the onset of the slow wave, or at least the zero crossing of the slow wave. Now this shows in sham nights what that would look like across a number of subjects. And again, you see that the onset is about here, and moving on from here, on an active night, they would produce slow waves at the same phase and frequency. So this shows the effects of stimulation, the number of slow wave events being recorded in each stage of sleep during wakefulness, stage 1, 2, and 3, REM sleep, and when people are moving. And in gray are sham nights, and in red, active nights. And one interesting thing is that for active nights, there was an increase in the number of slow wave events being recorded. So by applying this artificial slow wave, we're actually able to increase the number of slow waves that the brain is producing. Now, what was the effect on memory? That's shown here. So on this graph here, on the left, you see the F1 score, basically another signal detection measure, before sleep, and on the right, after sleep. And what you see, and when the slope is down, that means that they forgot a bit overnight. And the amount they forgot is shown by the slope. So we divided the stimuli up in an interesting way. So they trained on a set of stimuli and then were tested on another set. And some of those stimuli were identical to training, and some were what we call generalized stimuli. They are similar to training, but not exactly identical. And what's interesting is that with active stimulation, there really wasn't much of an effect on repeated test stimuli. But the generalized stimuli actually got better overnight. So people were better able to respond to these generalized stimuli after a night of stimulation relative to a night without stimulation, in which case they forgot. And this is interesting in that this whole idea of consolidation is that you're taking information, developing kind of a story behind it, and storing that in a way that allows you to apply it to new events. And what we're finding is that the stimulation seems to benefit you in a way that makes you better able to respond to new stimuli that share information with learned stimuli, but are novel in some way. Aaron Jones in my laboratory also, he looked at this data and found something interesting, and that's that there seems to be an optimal number of stimulation events overnight that that if you receive fewer or more than that, you don't do as well. But at around 220 stimulation events seem to be the peak for both the generalized stimuli and across all stimuli. We also found that this closed loop alternating current during sleep method improves sleep quality. So this shows data from the Karolinska sleep diary. And it basically asks you details about how well you slept the night before. So when they came in the lab the first night, we asked them about their prior night sleeping at home. And then the first night in the lab was an adaptation night where we didn't stimulate. They just got used to sleeping in the lab. And then the next night was either a Verum night where they received stimulation or a sham control night where they did not. And when they didn't receive stimulation, their quality of sleep was about the same as the adaptation night. But when they received stimulation, their quality of sleep was about as good as sleeping at home, which is pretty remarkable given that they're sleeping in my laboratory, which was never really designed to be a hotel room. And they're able to sleep wearing an electrocap all night, a lot of wires, really uncomfortable in some ways, but they slept as well as they slept at home if they received stimulation. Another thing we found that was interesting was that if we tested them the next morning, their ability to learn new information was dependent on whether they received stimulation the night before. And our initial idea was that they would do better on learning the next day as well. And we used this object location memory task where they would encode a set of objects like this, and then a number of 11 of the objects changed, and they had to identify which of the objects changed. And what we found was that unexpectedly, the sham group did better than the Verum group, so that the morning after stimulation, their ability to identify those 11 objects that changed was worse if they received stimulation the night before. And if we tested them about 8 hours later, that effect was still there. So performance was actually reduced with stimulation. And Mr. Bradley Robert here did that for his master's. And we're still trying to understand more about why this is. One idea is that one of the things that sleep does is basically an erasing process. It erases some of the information left in synapses that aren't considered to be useful, supposedly. But what might happen here is that by adding stimulation, it might overdo the erasing process. It's possible. And it actually, in any case, seems to reduce your ability to learn the next morning. So we're doing follow-up studies now. We're planning them. We'll start collecting that in a couple of weeks, trying to understand how this is exactly and if it replicates in other cases. So fully closed loop transcranial alternating stimulation can be used to effectively target endogenous slow waves. And we can increase slow wave power doing that. And increase in power correlates with behavioral changes in long-term memory performance and is generally consistent with theories of systems level consolidation. And it improves performance on generalized forms of learning, although, as I mentioned, also seems to reduce learning the next morning. Now, part 3, and this is another nighttime sleep study, but instead of electrical stimulation, we're trying auditory stimulation, something I'd like to call closed loop audible sound stimulation, or CLAS. So we're not the first to try this, of course. Palambros has a paper from 2017 that these images are taken from. And this was all started by Hongvet No and collaborators. And there's a paper in Neuron in 2013 that describes it. But the general idea is that you're, again, looking for slow wave oscillations and stimulating in order to enhance the amplitude of the oscillations. But instead of using electric current, you use a auditory tone that's timed at the onset of, or upswing of the oscillation. And the idea is that it changes the oscillation in such a way that it enhances people's ability to consolidate memories. So we're collaborating with Karen Crow, shown her here. She's CEO of Neurogenesis Incorporated, based in Santa Fe. And they're developing a system called the Neurogevity system. In this study, we had 23 subjects. They slept in our lab for up to 5 nights. They had a first acclimation night, as we did for the previous study. And it's within subject crossover design. We had 105 total nights, 23 acclimation and 82 data collection nights. In this case, they performed a task called the paired associates task. Basically, you get random pairs of words that you have to remember the pairing. And then for testing, after you're trained on these pairs of words, for testing, you're given one word and asked to recall the word that it was paired with. So it's a fairly difficult task. And all of these tasks are fairly difficult because people just want to go to sleep. And we give them these relatively boring training tasks to do as they go to sleep. But in any case, and then we test the next morning. And in this case, as developing this technology, we're finding that it's a bit noisier in some ways. So we remove subjects with noisy EEG. About a quarter of the data was removed, and that left 19 subjects with 29 Vera nights and 31 sham nights. What we found, a couple of things, that there was a 30% increase in the amplitude of slow oscillations during the Verum nights versus sham nights, and also an increase in the spindle activity. and spindle strength between the active or verum nights and sham control nights. And we saw an increase in people's ability to recall the word pairs. So between sham and verum, there's an increase of about 18.5%, which was significant. And the effect size here is a bit smaller than we see with TDCS. It was 0.25. So in conclusion here, class using neurogevity resulted in an increase of about 18.5% in word pairs that were recalled. We're updating the system to include other measures that might be useful. And we've had 2 grants funded, one by the National Science Foundation, the other by the Air Force. We'll be starting up these studies in a couple of weeks, hopefully, replicating, hopefully, the results we got previously with some additional things that we're looking at. So what's next? And overall, we've had great luck using neuroimaging to guide our stimulation, either anatomically using fMRI and MEG both, and also temporally using EEG. And I believe that anyone that wants to try this, the likelihood of success is much higher if you begin with neuroimaging data on the phenomena that you're trying to enhance. And as we get better at combining neuroimaging and neuromodulation, I expect that we'll develop more protocols to be able to treat the major brain and mental illnesses of today. So depression, anxiety, psychosis, traumatic brain injury, stroke, and Alzheimer's disease that we're working on now. All I think would benefit from this combination of imaging and stimulation. And not only in brain and mental illness, but in healthy people. Any improvement in learning, any improvement in attention is going to help everybody in their day-to-day lives, in their career, in going to school, education, training later in life, and so on. It would all benefit from improved performance. So I think the whole world could benefit from this work in various ways. Now, in order to move forward, some things need to happen. One of them that I think would be very beneficial are more FDA approvals in the US. And the rest of the world seems to look to the US, or at least it has in the past, for at what we're doing and what we're approving and adopting that in their own countries. So, and a lot of people look at what the FDA is doing in terms of healthcare. So recently, there have been a lot more approvals for TMS, and you'll notice at the same time, TMS is becoming more available. More people are getting treated for depression, for OCD now. A number of other things have been approved by the FDA for treatment using TMS. This then generates money that lead to more products, more use, and more people getting better. Another aspect to this is how do we monetize this better? There's a basic problem with all this, and compared to things like pharmaceuticals. With pharmaceuticals, you can patent a chemical, and you can make it so that you're the only company allowed to sell that chemical. And you can stop other companies from selling the same chemical. Electrons are unpatentable. Magnetic fields are unpatentable. Maybe we need to be less focused on patents and IP and more focused on services. So combining stimulation with other services in a clinic that's focused on treating depression, focused on treating Alzheimer's, and have it be one component of something larger to bring people in, to help them, and have the overall gains being made at a particular clinic be what you can advertise and what you can try and make income on. But without a way to make income, without a way to fund research, without a way to fund this work, we won't be able to give it to the world. We have to come up with a way to fund this that really makes sense. And the billions and billions of dollars that go into pharmaceuticals are based only on their ability to patent. If we can't patent, we're never going to get there in the same way. We have to be more creative about it. So many thanks to so many people. The early studies that we did, our later memory, DARPA impacts, electrical sleep study, and the recall class studies, so many people involved. And a final acknowledgement to our work on people working with us on the sleep studies. This is really difficult work, I have to tell you. Being up all night collecting data is not the easiest thing, but again, very worthwhile. And thank you so much for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are ready to take some questions. Actually, we have some questions already in the Q&A tool. But Vince, let me ask actually like general questions. Like the first would be to the pretext study, and you're showing the very huge Cohen's effect size comparing to drugs even. So when we can expect like the translation of these results to clinical application? Or if there will be any clinical translation of the effect of the pretext study with the Cohen's effect size in MCI patients.
Well, so I think what's needed next is I might have to pursue this with the FDA. That would be one way to go, which would mean a fairly large grant. So we're putting our data from the memory study together, and then seeing what we can do with that and where to take that next. I suspect I'll have to do a larger study for the FDA to approve it, but I haven't talked with them yet, so I don't know. I need them to tell me what they would need to approve this. And with FDA approval, that could potentially open up a lot of clinical use that wouldn't be there otherwise. There's other things needed, though. You need training. You need to be able to train people to do this. And it's relatively simple as a medical technique, but there's still a lot of complexity to it. So being able to train people to do it the right way, something else that would be needed to be able to get it out into the community. And getting healthcare providers interested in giving this to their patients. Again, the FDA approval would be huge for that, but it's really up to people out there having to treat people with dementia to be able to get those people interested in providing this as a service.
Okay. Thank you very much. And the second question is actually regarding the study with intermittent closed loop stimulation. Mm-hmm. And if you can speculate actually so what you are doing, you are increasing the number of slow waves and then interact with the spindles. But what would be the physiological mechanism of the consolidation? So interaction between hippocampus, cortex, locus cerebrus there in the middle. What would be a dopaminergic system? What would be the mechanism of the consolidation, the increase of the consolidation, the improvements of the encoding?
So I personally don't have any data to talk about the neurochemistry of this, but here's what I think. I've spent my career recording EEG. And during most of that time, it seems I've always dealt with it as an epiphenomenon, that just for quirky physical reasons, you're able to record EEG. But what this suggests is that global EEG might actually have some effect in the brain, that the brain is using it as a timing signal to go through a cyclical consolidation process. And that by enhancing the amplitude of that signal in the brain, people are better able to consolidate information. So it suggests that those slow waves aren't just an epiphenomenon, but might actually have a signaling property to them. And when we add to the amplitude of that, it adds to people's ability to perform the task that is being timed or being coordinated by that signal. That's where I am now. I think there might actually be something real, something useful about EEG that is not just epiphenomenal.
Okay, that's very good explanation. Let's go to some questions we have here in Q&A. Actually, there is one basic question regarding the sham. If you were using how you're using the sham for TACS condition, if you're using actually sham
No,
stimulation for TACS.
we simply did not do stimulation and overnight. And we asked people the next day if they sensed anything. And in that case, it was almost completely a chance. Nobody for the auditory stimulation, nobody heard the sounds, and for electrical stimulation, nobody felt the stimulation overnight. So it seems that simply not stimulating, because they're not conscious, there's nothing for them to interpret really. So, but we haven't in the past. Moving forward, we might use a smaller tone just to see what effect it has, but that's in the studies that we're about to start.
Okay, there is a question. Thank you. There is a question from Christine. Actually, congratulations. And question regarding involvement of the people with epilepsy, if they were included in any of these studies, and which kind of epilepsy had those people.
We haven't, we generally exclude people with epilepsy, not being absolutely certain that we wouldn't induce a seizure. So we haven't typically enrolled participants that have epilepsy.
Okay, so, and the other question from Christina is if there are any side effects that you know about regarding the stimulation. I guess both electrical and auditory stimulation.
Auditory stimulation, we haven't seen any negative side effects yet, although we'll be looking at the morning after learning effect that we saw with diminished learning the morning after stimulation. So we'll look at that with auditory stimulation as well. Aside from that, TDCS has a few well-known, relatively innocuous side effects. So some skin irritation is possible, although we find using EEG gel as opposed to saline blocks a lot of the what are probably oxides being developed at the TDCS electrode causing irritation. If we use gel, we don't see irritation much at all. Some people get headaches, generally the evening or after stimulation. Not very many, on the order of 5 to 10% maybe. And other very infrequent side effects for TDCS. But for alternating current stimulation, as we've done it here, we really didn't see any side effects, no headaches, no skin irritation. Alternating current, because of its push-pull effect, doesn't tend to deposit as much oxides at the electrode. So it's generally better in that sense.
Okay, thank you. There is a question from France. If there are any data on the long-term effects and how long do those results last in the end?
So far, we only know that the results of TDCS last 24 hours. And that's not that your ability to learn new information is increased. It's that you're able to recall information that you learned while receiving or shortly after receiving TDCS. So that those memories last at least 24 hours. And I've gotten that question so many times, I really need to set up a study with a longer delay. With the auditory stimulation, we did look at 1 week delay and didn't see any differences between active and sham. But we really didn't get enough people responding a week later to our query. So I would say we're not quite sure yet, but the data that we did get, it was almost identical between active and sham, the amount they were able to recall after a week. So I don't expect that there would be long-term forgetting that's different between normal learning and learning enhanced with TDCS. But until we test it, I can't say for sure.
Okay, actually, Alan is asking if there can be like a plateau for memory enhancement capability with stimulation, where you are actually arriving to the moment when you cannot improve.
So the methods that we've used, I think there's still, in the memory task, one interesting thing is that as people, as modeling suggested, there was more electric field entering the brain, there seemed to be more learning. And I didn't notice a plateau in that in particular. So I think we could probably go with higher field strengths and get even larger effects. I don't think we've reached a plateau for that group. And we haven't really experimented with higher current strengths in younger group yet, either. So I don't know if we've reached a plateau yet. I don't think so.
Okay, thank you. There is a question from John Mosher. Surprise, you found anode to be dominant in TDCS. Don't most studies emphasize cathodal stimulation?
Don't most studies emphasize cathodal stimulation? Is that the question?
Yes.
Maybe in some laboratories, but in our case, we did a direct comparison of anodal and cathodal, everything else being the same, and found that learning was greater with anodal. But what's interesting, so this is an interesting thing that I've noticed in the field. People tend to focus on one electrode or the other, but you always have two electrodes. You always have anodal and cathodal. You can't get away from it. We used a non-cephalic reference electrode. In this case, it would be cathodal for anodal on the head, partly so that there wasn't a focus of field as the current moved towards the reference electrode. Our idea was that it would be more spread out. Now, that was partly true, although there are some parts of the brain with the non-cephalic electrode where it still concentrates, like the inferior cerebellum. It looks, the bottom half of the cerebellum looks like a funnel. And so you actually get a fairly significant increase in inferior cerebellum of electric fields, according to the modeling. But in any case, you always have both. So the difference isn't so much in the protocol, but in the experimenter's focus of attention. And I'd like people to try and keep a more, I don't know how to say it exactly, but more realistic focus of attention. You always have both.
That's true. That's true. However, the non-cephalic location is a little bit complex to model because you are going to another part of the body. So you have models of the brain, scalp, skull, but then you move a little bit when you're going out from the brain is a little more complex. But you were using this actually for the F10 right inferior frontal gyrus. The montage was with non-encephalic. So in this case, we could say that on the brain there was only one modality.
Yeah. Although in reality, it's more complicated. Yeah, for sure.
Exactly. Thank you very much. There is another question regarding side effects that we covered already. There's another question from Magnus regarding possibility of to combine neuromodulation with pharmacological agents, physiotherapy, and other modalities. What's your take on this?
Ask Michael Nietzsche. He's done so much work with this, and being a psychiatrist, he's in a great position to do that. I'm a neuroscientist. I can't prescribe medications. So in my laboratory, we really haven't looked at this, not for lack of interest, but really because I can't prescribe medications myself. But yes, I think it's likely combining modalities in any way could potentially enhance an effect, and combining pharmaceuticals with non-invasive brain stimulation could give you a result that's better than using either alone, for sure, or more specific in some ways, or more interesting in other ways, you know, but it's not something I've tried.
Perfect, perfect. So this was last question. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the presentation, for presenting what you have done in your lab, and actually presenting the future, what you can expect in a few years, especially regarding the transcranial electrical stimulation field. We will host next webinar. We'll have some presenters from University of Turin talking about EEG neurofeedback in virtual reality. So please join us again for the next webinar. You can find information on our webpage, neurolexic.com. And we'll see you next time. Thank you, Vince, very much. Thank you a lot. We enjoyed a lot your presentation, and congratulations on your results.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. See you.
Bye.
See you soon again, all.